Many things that I've experienced in my life, there's been one thing that's always been a part of, my experience, and that was the normalization of things that I understood and seemed apparent to me, and that has led me towards, something I want to share with you right now. I don't really know where this will go, and I'm not sure how people will respond and react to what I have to say. But what I have to say is that I've discovered something that I don't believe has ever been seen or observed in any um, field of study when it pertains to the mind or psychology. That I've long had this interest in taking the world of the experiential transformation of ontology, Buddhism, what I consider to be, original Christian teachings, and finding a way to take that into the world of psychology to transform the practices of talk therapy and even the models through which we examine the human experience. The reason being is that you have so many different ways in which we examine and explain the mind. But the truth is that there is only one brain and one mind, and that anything that would be described in one domain, say spirituality, religion, ontology, must also be explainable in the world of biology, physiology, neuroscience, psychology. But human beings, seem to try to parcel out and explain the same thing, in different ways, or to think that they could have a spiritual experience without a psychological experience, or vice versa. And so you have one person that can talk to therapists, can go to church, can take medication, can participate in other practices, and we're all still trying to address the same thing, and that's the human experience. But what I've discovered is something I think is extraordinary. Well, I know it's extraordinary, and I know it's exactly right. That the problem that we've all experienced in terms of suffering is the ego. And while the ego has been traditionally thought of as a permanent structure or dynamic of the mind, it's actually not. It's an illusory component of the mind, a result of the fight or flight reaction being an invisible component of the wakeful experience of all people. This dynamic is a profound consequence of spoken language. That when human beings started to create language, it really opened up a new area of the mind. Part of the imagination that would be reserved for words that describe things, that would enable more profound communication and the sharing of ideas and concepts, words that we continue to add to the list in our vocabulary. And while this unlocked communication, it had a catastrophic effect on the human experience, particularly the imagination, as well as the world as it occurs in the wakeful moments of one's existence. And the reason for this profound experiential shift is because part of the development of all animals is the genesis of the fight or flight mechanism, a portion of our psychological experience which addresses external threats to one's well-being, one's life. When animals experience a threat external to them, what happens is that their mind will become fixated on the threat. Look at what happens to people in an emergency. Let's just say you're in the movie theaters, right? If a gunman came in, you're going to leave your purse, you're going to leave your popcorn, you're going to head for the exit. When people are in this fight or flight reaction, the panic sets in and their mind just goes into a state of survival, where what happens is that the brain is still processing the entire outside experience, but what it does is it concentrates the wakeful experience by eliminating anything observational that is not paramount to survival. Now, why this is important to understand is this is what causes the experience of all people to emerge in modern life. That in early childhood development, children, are free little beings running around without fear, without boundaries to their expression, without boundaries to their imagination, but with limited life experience, with limited vocabulary. You know, we don't really look at them as enlightened, but it's why when you look at children, you look at animals, you look at them with fondness, you admire their freedom, their peacefulness, or their joy. Joy that you lose as an adult. We always thought when we were adults we'd have freedom, but how'd that really work out, right? Well, why this happens is that at some point in early childhood, 3, 4, 5, 6, the child will have their first real stress reaction. Something will happen in the environment, something, that frightens them. It could be parents yelling, it could be something they dropped. It's really an arbitrary experience. While we tend to look at what causes the human being to suffer in adulthood as a result of trauma, it actually is not traumatic. It can be a very ordinary moment, it can be a very traumatic moment, but it really makes no difference. It's an inevitable experience that it is going to happen, and it happens for everybody. The age at which it happens has a profound influence on what happens. That many mental health disorders really are because this experience happens too early, like in the case of narcissistic personality disorder, for example, because if this fight or flight trigger happens at an age before the child has enough cognitive development for pattern recognition, rather than having a pattern recognition device implanted in their mind, they have an overarching, patternless, experiential fear of everything outside of themselves, which causes them to be unable to later develop a more normalized personality structure using the same mechanism. It arrests their emotional development in an earlier stage of maturation where the child only experiences the world through the lens of its own needs, and its emotions are reflections based on the emotions of caregivers. A simplistic reward mechanism, whereas the happiness of the mother is rewarded by the happiness of the child, or the sadness of the mother is rewarded or punished by an experiential expression of disapproval. That is why narcissists become manipulative later, is because they live permanently at the effect of emotional changes in others based on the retention of this mechanism, in which the trauma or the stress reaction occurred may dictate the duration of these experiences, the severity of it, and has implications for the further development of other emotional experiences. But being locked in this state, it prevents the development of empathy, it prevents the development of maternal or paternal emotions, even other emotions altogether, emotions that would not be necessary for infant children or toddlers. And this person can go on to develop cognitively and then has to develop emulated behaviors as a way to engage the external experience. And living absent other emotional development, they have an inability to empathize because they cannot generate accurate experiences modeled after those of other people. Now, as we go later in age to a more normalized age where children have developed cognitive functioning, the ability to recognize patterns and identify individuals in their visual field, this fight or flight mechanism is what results in all human suffering. What happens is that this experience of being, what we call it, triggered, but the activation of the fight or flight causes a profound experience of there being something wrong. Now, this experience of something wrong is just an experience, a profound emotional sense, but now with words, the child will experience as something wrong as something wrong with me. And in this pattern recognition state that normally would just develop a way of patternizing an object like an animal, like recognizing a wolf or a hippopotamus for another animal, or a snake or a hawk, the human mind will start to examine the circumstances. It'll look at the parents, it'll look at faces, it'll look at many things, and listening to the words spoken and trying to understand the implications of this experience. This experience, there being something wrong with me, will lead to a process of confusion. And in this state, this dissociation from a more objective view, the child will start to make assertions, will have thoughts like, I'm not good enough, and not good enough is the primary one. Thoughts of perhaps being broken, unlovable, thoughts of not mattering, thoughts that will continue and cascade, and there will be many thoughts within this one moment, and each of those will then branch off to be its own individual pattern recognition device in language, in tone of voice, in facial expressions, and in circumstance. And this experience will be very profound in defining the rest of the life of the individual. It's not trauma, it is an inescapable, unavoidable collision between our past in the animal kingdom and our existence as objective conscious beings. That we had transcended from animals based on the power of the human mind. That the imagination is a surrogate for reality, where human beings were the only organisms that can think about the future and actually invent it in their mind as a way to intervene, to cause outcomes, to imagine tomorrow. But you see, absent language and without the experiential self, the imagination only included the world outside. It did not include any thoughts of self because thoughts were not possible, because there was no language. But now, with the inclusion of language, what happened was that rather than having a fight or flight reaction based on external threat, the human being has a fight or flight based on the objectification of self that then becomes projected onto the outside world and experienced in the same way as an external threat, but then connected to circumstance, causing people to attach to one another. It's why you could be guilt tripped, for example, or you feel like somebody doesn't approve of you. It'll cause you to be triggered into an experience of being not good enough and recreate the entire emotional pattern of that one moment. It'll be an overlay, an overarching projected experience that eliminates the objective view. Now, the objective view is always present within the subconscious mind, as the mind is just a profound computer for assessing reality. And normalized emotions will always be experienced. And it's as if in any moment there are two beings in one. It's just that the objective subconscious experience has no attachments, and so it does not have any experiential necessity towards intervention. In fact, the psychology, all it really does is that when somebody's in a fight or flight, it concentrates and fixates on the experiential threat, and it eliminates from the momentary conscious experience anything deemed unimportant for the survival. And so when you think about the fight or flight of somebody panicking and heading for the exit, or you think about fighters fighting in a cage, when people are fighting one another, the whole sum of the person's processes in terms of their wakeful experience is fixated on the other person, where they're oblivious to what's happening outside. They don't pay attention to the cameras. They don't think about tomorrow. They don't experience anything outside of themselves, while at the same time, their eyes and ears are absorbing all of that sensory information nonetheless. And this is why human beings suffer, is because the vast imagination becomes very catastrophized, because the human mind is going to be directed and guided, even in thoughts, that the thoughts that are generated automatically exist within these patternized paradigms of experience. where the thoughts are merely reflectant upon the fixation and towards all the attachments within the person's experience of the outside world, circumstances, the people that are disappointed, the tests that are coming up, all the bills. And what this does is it suspends the human experience within the tunnel vision of fight or flight perpetually, including within the imagination. Within the imagination, even accessing memories will only allow the memories to be viewed through the lens of their importance within the fight or flight mechanism, causing a person to have no objectivity when reflecting on their past. It's why there's pain. It's why, when triggered into your mind, when thinking about your past, trying to solve the riddle of something's wrong, you're already triggered into your head, compelled into the same state of confusion and figuring it out. You see, that initial moment where all of these emotions and thoughts originated became a moment of reflection, this figuring out, and the child generated a compensatory mechanism of aspiring towards perfect. Now, perfect is just a situational paradigm of looking at the circumstances in which someone exists in the moment. The person is to try to figure out a solution as a way to be, a way to behave. And so perfect is an ongoing adaptive stratagem that gets triggered by any number of these experiential triggers, but they all exist as alive and real, as an overarching fear, because you actually fear the emotional consequences of this mechanism and therefore keeping yourself within a state of stress at all times. The normalization of the physiology of this causes the person to be unperceptive to the fact that they are always within a stress reaction. It's why we have access to this greater expanse of our imagination when dreaming or even taking hallucinogens. But in the wakeful experience, the human's mind is literally contained within a very narrow range of motion, limiting access to creativity and actually limiting access to normalized ways of learning through experience. You see, the mind is very powerful and it can create new paradigms of thought in very spontaneous transactions that are rapid and imperceptible, yet result in profound levels of experiential awareness growing as a function of time. And when we look at the expression of intelligence in the human experience, we fail to recognize that this fight or flight mechanism is such a profound inhibitory device that it limits access towards the imagination and the visualization process. And now we think that there's creative people and more intelligent people, whereas when you really look, the truth is that human beings have an experiential range of motion in terms of the expression of intelligence, which really merely speaks towards the individual's access towards the same imagination that anybody and everybody actually possesses within. That you might look at, say, a playwright and wonder, how does he have the creativity for that? Yet you can have profound creative dreams that are spontaneously generated that could rival a Hollywood movie, yet in your wakeful experience, you don't have access towards that level of creativity. Where your thoughts of your own insufficiency block access, where just the thoughts of tomorrow, the thoughts that might start leading down a path of creativity are disrupted because those thoughts and what's being created within them violate a trigger, that you're not enough for that you'll actually imagine the rejection of sharing the idea and you'll literally stop the formation of ideations. And so, as we have limited our access to our own capacity to learn and grow knowledge spontaneously, and imagining other people that are genius and creative types have some special brain, we fail to examine that every other species on the planet has a very narrow range in terms of the intelligence levels expressed within each individual species. That if you looked at chimpanzees, gorillas, any other species, dolphins, killer whales, elephants, when examining them for intelligence, or octopuses, you don't see any range. You see very comparable structures. And if you measured the brain of Einstein in terms of the total volume or size or surface area of the cerebral cortex or amount of brain cells or tissue, you would find that the deviation is very minimal, that you can't explain genius or creativity in terms of anything related to the structure of the brain. But it's actually just access. That what I've discovered for myself is a profound breakthrough in the, experience of my own intelligence. Not related to me as a person, but just access towards something that everybody shares. That the creative capacity of the human mind was the birthright of all people before language. It's the catastrophic impact of the fight or flight mechanism that thwarts all access, fixating one's mind to merely be used as a tool within the paradigm of the fight or flight. That you have people that during the same span of time that Sir Isaac Newton might have invented calculus, that human being has simply ruminated about an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, stuck, locked within repetitive thoughts. And then we educate people in reverse, relying upon short-term to long-term memory in an education process that all but indoctrinates people to be unaware of their own capacity to generate knowledge, to think in a way that is generative and Socratic. That after doing my first ontological trainings, I realized that it was very difficult to find people to have conversations. The reason being is that when I would talk to people, I realized that when people asked me questions about what I thought, well, my mind would start to generate ideas spontaneously during the conversation where I would see things. And I realized that that process was absent in the vast majority of all people I encountered. That if I asked them what they thought, they would merely be accessing memories of things they were educated in or things they read. And if they ran out, they would feel uncomfortable and qualified to even share thoughts or ideas. And I realized this is something I spoke with, to one of my doctor friends, the only person I really felt I could talk to. And it was because when we talked, it was ideas would form. That when I spoke about subjects with people, I realized that the development of my understanding would be generative, expansive, whereas other people did not seem to possess access, and I wondered why. I thought that maybe they just didn't want the responsibility of understanding their world, or they had a fear of looking bad or sounding stupid. And all those are likely a part of that dynamic, but it's also a part of education. That I was told I had a learning disability because I had a hard time paying attention in class. But I had a very active imagination. I could build remote control cars. But you see, that experience catastrophized me. It had me believe I was broken, which also inhibited my creativity. It really wasn't until about 5 years ago I discovered I was creative, that I'd been fighting it, that I'd been suppressing it, that this experience of rejection, this experience of people never listening, this experience of nobody in my world ever really having any interest in me or the thoughts that I had or my ideas or inventions actually caused it to become dormant, inactive. I would be analytical, I would do my jobs, but I never really discerned the uniqueness of that imagination. And when I did discover my creativity, I had a breakthrough in my mind where I stopped having fear when it came to allowing for the proliferation and continuity of thoughts. And this led to rapid development of ideas around inventions for car parts where I could create a whole supercharger in my mind rapidly, effortlessly, and it would be not even something that would happen through rumination. In fact, many ideas would form for objects and include physics and things that I can pull from knowledge into this world. And, what I've discovered is that the access to the mind and the imagination is the primary determinant in the expression and development of human intelligence, not any actual physical, reality around the brain, but merely the emotional dynamics of the fight or flight reaction. And so, what I've discovered in my coaching is that I developed a methodology. I took some of the exercises I learned in Landmark, pioneered by Werner Erhard, and I discovered something different, something new. What I discovered in coaching was that the visual experience of a recent memory was not in any way, shape, or form significant in me understanding when coaching someone. What I did is I developed a method where I would take somebody from explaining, pulling them from rumination, and I would put them into any recent memory of anything stressful or traumatic from their point of view. And people that had suffered narcissistic abuse were the perfect canvas for this, simply because the profound nature of the suffering would enable a more easy access towards those memories, towards the feelings themselves, meaning. And so if I had somebody just go to a recent memory, I would just request that they go into a memory, an actual memory, not paraphrasing, not talking about a grouping, but just putting themselves into a moment. This was how I got them out of thinking and into experiencing. Now, during this process, what I would do is I wanted them to remember the original moment. And so I accessed a recent moment because the mind of understanding is a dissociative experience that creates a bifurcation from an objective experience. It's an emotional deterrent, a way of not experiencing what's actually happening, allowing for the reformation of a reality consistent with the aspirations of the ego. Idealizations of narcissists, for example, and understanding bad behaviors to maintain and preserve this attached reality, including an attached future where happiness would become available outside the boundaries of this existential suffering caused by this experience itself. And so I knew that I could not have them access memories by having them try to understand. And by going through the memories, merely looking for the emotional dimensions, absent any attachment towards the visual experience or the circumstantial, led to the discovery that the entire list found within the discard of a narcissist would be found in every area of life. Profound contextual phenomenon between good enough, not good enough, where the drive to aspire towards good enough to avoid the experience of something being wrong or broken was an all-pervasive, all-consuming experiential paradigm that was an overlay for every moment of one's reality. And when guiding people to see this, it was like taking their fixation off of one moment and having them see the continuity, that they would zoom out, if you will, when I would ask them, say, well, this experience of being broken and not enough that you think is because of the discard, right? Well, was that experience and feeling, was that in the relationship? And without exception, of course. The abandonment, did you feel that then? Yes, you felt it then too. And then I'd go through the list and they would see every single emotion from the discard that they think is because they got discarded. Well, now it's in the relationship. And then they would say, well, I'd say, what about family? Wait a second, it's there too. Wait, it's at work. Wait, it's in my friendships. Wait, it's in my last relationship. And this would then result in an unraveling experience where, when guided this way, the original moment would appear. They would tell me I'm 6 years old. And I would say, what happened? Now, this original moment is important to understand that while no other moment in the rest of their life, including the so-called trauma experiences, you see, the trauma experiences are seen as significant only because when looking through the traditional lens of psychology, we create significance around the visual or circumstantial component of the memory thinking that that might lead to a discovery in the past, like a traumatic memory that's similar in nature. Like if this woman is talking about a boyfriend dumped her, well, was there abandonment with the father? And of course, you'll find it. You'll find it because that experiential paradigm exists everywhere. And so you can play connect the dots simply by looking at the circumstances, and you can do that for 20 years. But in this paradigm, what we're seeing is we're seeing that looking at the original moment, it may not be traumatic, it might be, it doesn't matter, it's just original. It's the first one, it's where all of it came from. And what we see there is we see a profound distinction between what actually happened and what the child thought it meant. You see, this is the source of all of the problems of human behaviors, all mental illnesses not associated with actual, congenital defect or physiological anomaly. Even some or most disorders that are physiological are only because of the suppressive or repressive effects of persistent anxiety or states of depression that change the physiology by modifying, let's say, receptor sites. If you're in sustained depression, well, you might get a downregulation of serotonin and norepinephrine or dopamine receptors that may result in the appearance of bipolar disorder. When someone exits a state of depression, they may be hypersensitized towards these neurotransmitters, resulting in anomalous behaviors like elevated moods or mixed states, which could then be normalized later if they were not misconstrued as an actual physiological anomaly or chemical imbalance. But back to the original moment. The original moment, what you'll see, is a vast difference between what actually took place and what the child thought or felt. And so it's important to separate those two, because this separation is something that will demonstrate that the emotions, even in the original moment, were not even related to or, you know, connected with the moment itself, other than being experienced. And this is the case for all moments. You know, we've catastrophized our emotions this way. And so what you'll see is an example. Here's an example of someone I talked to. 6 years old, a girl. Now what I ask is I say, well, what happened, right? And they'll start telling the story, but the story will still be an enmeshment of feelings, thoughts, emotions. And why it's important to do it this way, by taking them back through the experiential of the emotions, is because the adult mind has all these conflations, all these new terms, all this new age understanding, all the therapy, all the books they've read, and they'll merely explain their past and creating false memories, paraphrasing experiences, general themes that be confused with memories as their imagination puts these stories together. They become experts, and thus they do not have access to the experiences, their authentic memories. And so now when we're in the authentic memory, normally or entirely inaccessible in normal analytical conversation with therapists, we see that this original moment, the child, we're putting them in the memory of the child. Now I'm asking them, well, what happened? Now they'll start to tell the story, including feelings and thoughts. And nope, I tell them, no, 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 no. I just need to know what happened in reality. And then you write it down. And so here's one. This emotional story of trauma and abandonment rapidly changed into something very simple. And we get down to business. Here's somebody that suffered with all this narc abuse and whatnot, but here's the original moment. Little girl sitting on the stairs, parents in the kitchen, dad yells at mom. That's what happened. In the little girl's interpretation, she was too small to help her mom. She felt powerless, helpless. She thought she was not good enough. She knew there was something wrong. She had a profound experience of abandonment, interpreting this moment as indicative of her father's intention to leave. She associated her weakness and powerlessness towards an inability to help her mother. She experienced being stuck, paralyzed. She thought that she was unlovable, that her unlovability had something to do with the fighting of the parents. And so when I list out all those emotions, what you find is that list matches the discard phase nearly identically. And then what I show them is I say, well, does your dad yelling at your mom mean that you're unlovable? No. Does your dad yelling at your mom mean you're abandoned? No. Does your dad yelling at your mom mean you're not good enough? No. I'll go through the whole list. Then I'll ask him, well, what did you have to be? I had to figure it out. I needed to be perfect. And perfect is a universal, experiential answer to solve the not good enough, to solve the broken. It's a evaluation of circumstance. It's a recreation of the pattern recognition where the human being forever will analyze, try to figure out the situation to find the escape, to escape the movie theater of not good enough. They need to strategize and be nice, be strong, be whatever they think they need to be. And this will become an evolutionary adaptation that they will continue to learn, to grow, to learn, to try to train the perfect, to try to become and aspire, to always try to overcome this experience of not enough. And here's what I ask them then. What have you never been able to become in your life? Perfect. Never been able to do it. So you've never been able to quite get to good enough, have you? No. I've never been able to be lovable. I've never been able to get rid of the something's wrong. I've never felt like I'm broken. I've never been able to fix myself. Never. What's this cost you in your life? Everything. Love, happiness, joy, peace. What's the impact? I'm alone. I'm broken. I'm lonely. Then what we do is we start to dissociate these experiences. I give up the right to have the complaint that I'm not good enough in my life forever, something I learned from one of my coaches. And as you do these, it's important to know something, that these experiential paradigms are ways of being that orchestrate an external experience that the person confuses with themselves. And what happens when confronting these paradigms is that they amplify, they become loud. The person becomes confused, they fumble the words. And what I tell them is like, now what we need to do is we're declaring this statement. You may notice there's two voices in one. What I want you to see is that the voice in your mind isn't you. You're not listening to me, you're trying to understand. Your understanding is literally just trying to get that knowledge, that explanation that's going to help you become good enough. You're still stuck within it. I want you to see it as separate. I want you to observe it. I want you to observe it, and I want you to say it anyway. I want you to declare this. And as we do this, we are bringing back into existence the objective experience. We're taking the person into the objective self, the same self that put these words into existence in the mind. And they start to release them. And I'll go through the whole list. By the time I've gotten through the whole list, I'll try a few and I'll ask. I'll keep checking in. What are you experiencing? How are you feeling? And whatever they tell me gives me clues. I'll look at the words. The experience they're having will be connected to a word, and then we'll do that one. And then when we've done all of them, I give up the right to have the complaint that there's something wrong with me. I give up the right to have the complaint that I'm broken. Checking in on how they're saying it indicates how they're being. Are they being confused? Are they trying to get the words right? Or are they actually in the moment present to the words they're declaring? And when they've done all of it, I'll ask, what are you experiencing now? I don't know. They won't have words for the experience. I'll ask them, is it peaceful? It is. What I'll say then is I'll say, listen, this is something I learned. This is a high level of awareness. I don't know if you're ready, but here we go. That human beings are essentially operating as meaning-making machines. This is something I learned in Landmark. That this is automatic, the meaning. that everything means something, that this meant to you that you were not good enough. Look at the discard. Does being, ending a relationship with someone with a mental illness mean that you're not good enough? Does that mean you're broken? No. The truth is that absent the genesis of meaning in this paradigm, the objective experience of reality is absent meaning. It's just life. It's just what's happening. And it doesn't mean anything that there's no meaning. It doesn't mean there's no God. It doesn't mean there's no love. It just means that life itself is empty and meaningless. Life is empty and meaningless, and it is empty and meaningless that it is empty and meaningless. When the person sees this experientially, that is when they reach everything and nothing. The born-again experience, the transformation, the enlightenment can be done inside of a 30-minute to an hour conversation for every man, woman, child. And the voice in the mind goes totally silent, absolutely quiet for the first time in the person's life. And they're having their first objective moment, able to see the illusion of the ego for what it is, a trap. And we'll ask them, what do you see as possible? Everything. What inspires you? They say, being happy, joy, peaceful, love, whatever it is they see. I borrow from Landmark the genesis of possibility. The possibility I'm inventing for myself and for my life is the possibility of being joyful, peaceful, loving, powerful, whatever they want. And we recognize that the experience of the external world is a continuum of being. The experience of the outside world always necessitates the being. That people are always being a response or reaction towards the external experience, necessitating this way of existing. And when you put new ways of being, it creates the same paradigm, but now consciously, now favorably. And that's what happens, is they will say that and they will become it as a way to be. And so what essentially I've done is I've taken from what Landmark used to use for the distinction they call winning formula or strong suit, 3 different personality paradigms, and discovering that it's all one and that you may create alternates, sure, but it's always perfect. It's always figured out perfect. Perfect doesn't necessarily mean Ken doll or Barbie doll. It just means for the moment, for mom, for dad. And later in life, what we call trauma will just be an activation of this system in a very accelerated or aggressive way, catastrophic vicious circle or fight or flight reaction that we will remember. But often the original ones are not really ever seen because they won't be the most traumatic. And the issue is that psychology is still looking through the lens. That's why we see people as broken, damaged. It's a projection. The people that study psychology are doing so motivated by the same effort to figure themselves out and merely projecting that onto other human beings. And so psychology and all of its work has afforded us the ability to examine what's actually taking place within the experiences of transformational learning and have new ways of accessing that realm. And in what I've discovered is the overarching, inescapable overlay of reality is merely the tunnel vision caused through the attachment mechanism of the fight or flight reaction itself, that any human being, and including narcissists, can escape that. And I've done it with everyone. But the narcissists are more challenged because their mechanism of reaction is short, quick, and most of them do not have enough cognitive awareness to dissociate from the reactionary mind. Some of them that I've encountered don't even have creativity because they only exist reacting, to the point where they cannot visualize. They need external things to look at to create a vision. And it's a very interesting thing to see that the CNC operator, he needed a blueprint to look at a CAD file, to look back and forth. And many people like this have to watch videos because they can't use their own mind. But nonetheless, the entire human experience of suffering, I believe and know for the first time, can be effectively cured, not through 20 years of meditation, not through 3 days in a seminar, but in one conversation. One. And that can lead to anything. And my interest in psychology would be, well, the psychologists would have to do it themselves. And then all the knowledge that they've accumulated, well, it could be brought to bear. I would want it to be tested, to just demonstrate it with any mental illness, just to have it documented, because we need to, we have to take it away from the mystical, the spiritual, the religious, to the practical and ordinary, because all we're really speaking about is a restoration towards a normal, objective experience for each person, where we can start to look at life from the standpoint of what's fulfilling, what's workable, what's integrous, what makes sense, what's human, because we don't have a lot of time to waste. That the aspirations of the ego are entirely destructive, and left unchecked will most certainly annihilate humanity. We've invented nuclear weapons. We commit to the most egregious inhuman actions, and we seem to obviously have the inability to avoid the dehumanization of people outside the boundaries of our group thinking across any particular group. To be living in a world where we're still talking about race, misogyny, religion, geography, history as a basis for war, for conflict. It's a cosmic absurdity. And it makes sense why anybody who has experienced what I have experienced would consider that experience to be the salvation of not just the individual, but of mankind. And it explains why they nail you to crosses or kill the Martin Luther Kings for just having a dream of the table of brotherhood. It's because the ego and its own experience of reality is threatened by anything that changes the reality or threatens the experience of the reality, that people's attachments towards their own fixing, changing, and their happiness in the future causes them to experience anything that threatens their status quo reality as an existential threat within this paradigm of fight or flight. And so we seek to destroy anything that threatens the status quo. Failing to recognize the status quo would turn the earth into one big piece of charcoal if left unchecked. And it's only the shoulders of the good that we stand upon. That if you took out the Jesuses, the Buddhas, and the Martin Luther Kings, where would we be? It's Lord of the Flies. It's unchecked ego. It's why they envisioned, salvation, and why we thought, the way we did about, what can happen without, an experiential intervention. That this experience is not to be understood absent the experience. That there is no way to explain it other than to have someone feel it. Jesus, they called it God. Buddha, they called it enlightenment. Nate, I call it normal. I call it just being a person. I explain it merely by understanding the implications, the cost of language. The cost of language. The cost of language was the original sin. Think, therefore I am. The invention of the ego. The inevitable consequence of language introduced to a mind evolved without it. A restoration towards an objective external experience and direct unfettered access to one's creativity and imagination, unlocking the potential of the human mind for anybody and anybody that's interested in listening. It's easy. It's painless. It's actually fun. Who would have thought? Not me. Why me? I don't know. But it's true. I hope I can help a few people before the CIA comes for me. That's actually not to be paranoid, but this world doesn't look favorably upon those that tamper with their investment in control. So I understand that. I just need to keep it from being a religious thing or a social transformation and just say, no, it's just psychology, don't worry about it. Let's just treat a few people, get it published, and see what happens. Just want to plant the seeds, then go relax. Good night.